A paper just dropped in Science Advances, and it contains a sentence that I genuinely had to read 3 times. Researchers found chemical traces of a specific plant toxin on arrowheads that are 60,000 years old. Not residue that could be anything. Not maybe organic material. Specific alkaloids from a specific poisonous plant, identified molecule by molecule. And the implications of that are kind of staggering, because this isn't just about arrows, and it's not just about poison. It's about what your brain has to be capable of doing to even come up with the idea in the first place. Let me set the scene. Umhlatuzana Rock Shelter, KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, about 35 kilometers west of modern-day Durban. The rock shelter was excavated back in the 1980s, and it's a well-known site from the Middle Stone Age. Buried in a layer dated to about 60,000 years ago, archaeologists pulled out these tiny quartz tools called backed microliths. Think of them as little geometric stone inserts, 10 to 19 millimeters long. Some of them fit on your thumbnail. Now, these kinds of tools have been interpreted as arrowhead components for a while. The shape, the breakage patterns, the microscopic damage, it all points to them being projectile tips, probably hafted onto arrow shafts with adhesive. That part isn't new. What's new is what a team led by Sven Isaksson from Stockholm University, along with Anders Högberg and Marlies Lombard, decided to do next. They took 10 of these tiny stone tools and ran them through gas chromatography mass spectrometry. Basically, they vaporized microscopic scrapings of residue off the surfaces and looked at what molecules came out the other end. And on 5 of those 10 arrowheads, they found buphanidrine. On one of them, they also found epibuphanidrine. If those names mean nothing to you, that's fine. They're alkaloids, and they come from a very specific group of plants, the Southern African Amaryllis family. The most likely source? A plant called buphanidrine. Its common name in Afrikaans is gifbol, which translates to poison onion. Its scientific genus name literally means ox killer, from the Greek words for ox and killer. This is not a subtle plant. At toxic doses, its alkaloids cause muscular paralysis, respiratory failure, hallucinations, and death. Small amounts can kill a rodent in 20 to 30 minutes, and it was on these arrowheads 60,000 years ago. Now, why does this matter so much? It matters because before this study, the oldest direct chemical evidence of poison on a weapon was about 6,700 years old, from Kruger Cave, also in South Africa. There was a disputed older candidate from Border Cave, a 24,000-year-old wooden stick with fatty acid residues that some researchers interpreted as a poison applicator. But that interpretation has been challenged. There was no broad consensus on it. This new finding doesn't just push the date back a little. It leaps backward by more than 50,000 years. As Isaksson himself put it, it's quite a leap. But the age isn't even the most interesting part. Think about what using poison on an arrow actually requires. You need to know which plant, out of hundreds growing around you, contains something useful. You need to know how to extract the toxic compounds from the bulb. You need to process it, probably mix it into the adhesive you're already using to attach the stone tip to the shaft. And then you need to understand something truly remarkable. You need to understand that this invisible substance, this juice you smeared on a rock, is going to do something you cannot see to an animal you haven't hit yet, hours or even days from now. That is abstract causal reasoning about invisible, delayed effects. That is not simple. That is not primitive. That is a cognitive leap that, until very recently, most researchers assumed happened tens of thousands of years later. One of the researchers, Lombard, offered an analogy that I think really lands. She said that tracking game through the bush and then focusing to shoot an arrow accurately over about 30 meters at a moving target without disturbing it is cognitively similar to driving a manual transmission car in city traffic or flying a drone for several hours and landing it on a specific spot. These weren't people fumbling through survival. These were people executing multi-step precision strategies, and the arrows themselves tell the story. These tiny stone points were never designed to kill anything on their own. At 10 to 19 millimeters, they can't inflict lethal trauma on a large animal. The bow was deliberately weak. The arrow alone couldn't bring down an eland or a kudu. That was never the point. The arrow was a delivery system. The stone tip was a syringe. The actual weapon was the chemistry. After the shot, hunters would track the weakening animal for hours, sometimes days. A duiker might go down in 2 hours. A giraffe? Up to 3 days. That means you shoot something and then you walk. For 3 days. Following tracks, reading the landscape, trusting that the invisible thing you did is working inside an animal you can no longer see. That takes patience. That takes confidence in your knowledge. And that takes the ability to plan ahead in a way that's fundamentally different from just throwing a rock at something. Now, what makes this study particularly convincing is the way the researchers built their case. They didn't just find molecules on old rocks and call it a day. They used a three-pronged comparison. First, the 60,000-year-old arrowheads themselves. Second, they analyzed 250-year-old poison bone arrowheads held in the Museum of Ethnography in Stockholm. Some of these were likely collected by the Swedish naturalist Carl Peter Thunberg during his travels in South Africa in the 1770s. And third, they tested modern reference samples from actual buphanidrine bulb exudate. All three groups produced the same molecular signature, the same alkaloids, from the same plant, spanning 60,000 years. Think about that for a second. The same recipe, the same plant species, used for the same purpose. For 60,000 years. That might be the longest continuously used technology in human history. Longer than any building, longer than any written tradition. 3,000 generations of humans handing this knowledge from parent to child, and it survived all the way to the 18th century, when a Swedish botanist walked into South Africa and collected arrows that matched. Or did it? And this is where we need to pump the brakes a little, because that continuity is suggested by the evidence, but not proven by it. It's entirely possible that this knowledge was lost and reinvented multiple times over those 60 millennia. The chemical match tells us the same plant and the same compounds were used at both ends of the timeline. It doesn't tell us the chain was unbroken. Still, even independent reinvention is impressive. It means this plant's properties were discoverable and worth discovering, over and over again. And here's where we should be honest about what the skeptics and the researchers themselves flag as limitations. First, the sample size is small, 10 arrowheads out of 216 microliths from that layer. 5 positives out of 10 is striking, absolutely. But the broader population of artifacts in that layer remains untested. The researchers explain this as a minimally destructive sampling strategy. They're trying to preserve material for future work, which is responsible, but it does mean we're making inferences from a small window. Second, there's no direct proof that buphanidrine actually grew near Umhlatuzana 60,000 years ago. There are no preserved plant remains from the site. The argument is based on the plant's current distribution. It grows within 12.5 kilometers of the shelter today, and its long evolutionary history going back 10 to 20 million years. Southern Africa had no ice sheets during the period, so conditions were probably fine for it. That's reasonable, but it's not the same as finding the plant right there in the sediment. Third, some of the chemical match scores are what the researchers call fair rather than good or excellent. 2 of the samples scored in the 680s against the reference database, while others hit the 870s. The ethno-historical comparison arrows scored even higher. Degraded 60,000-year-old residues are always going to be analytically challenging, and the researchers acknowledge that structurally related alkaloids can produce similar spectra. They argue their identifications are solid, and independent experts largely agree, but this is where the inherent messiness of ancient chemistry shows up. Fourth, and I think this nuance matters, the poison itself was relatively simple. Justin Bradfield from the University of Johannesburg pointed out that these 60,000-year-old hunters seem to have used a single component poison, just the plant extract. Compare that to the 7,000-year-old arrows from Kruger Cave, which contained a multi-ingredient cocktail of different toxins. So we might be looking at an earlier, simpler stage of toxicological knowledge. Still sophisticated, but not yet the full pharmacological toolkit that later groups developed. Esther Oras, an archaeochemist from the University of Tartu, called the study really groundbreaking. but also acknowledged it was kind of a lucky case because the chemical analysis lined up so perfectly with the ethnographic and historical records around this specific plant. Similar studies at other sites might not produce such clean results, so the evidence is strong, but it isn't bulletproof. That's how science works at the edges of what's knowable. What I find most compelling, though, is the bigger picture this fits into. This discovery doesn't stand alone. It arrives alongside a growing mountain of evidence from the South African Middle Stone Age that keeps telling us the same thing. Humans were cognitively modern far, far earlier than the old textbook narrative suggested. That old narrative, the one many of us grew up with, went something like this. There was a creative explosion in Europe around 40 to 50,000 years ago. Cave paintings, jewelry, sophisticated tools, all appearing relatively suddenly. And the implication was that this was when human minds finally became truly modern. Everything before that was supposedly simpler, more basic. The problem is, Africa kept pulling up evidence that wrecked that timeline. Engraved ochre at Blombos Cave, 100,000 years old. Shell beads, 75,000 years. Compound adhesive hafting at Sibidu Cave, 70,000 years. Heat treatment of stone to improve tool making, 72,000 years. And at Sibudu, 77,000 years ago, people were making bedding from plants with insecticidal properties, meaning they already understood that certain plants kept bugs away. They were already using plant chemistry for practical purposes. And now this, 60,000 years ago, poison arrows. Not just using plants, not just making glue, but understanding that a specific invisible compound from a specific plant would produce a specific delayed effect on a living animal. That's pharmacology without the label. Actually, speaking of pharmacology, the line between poison and medicine is literally just dosage. Buphanidrine isn't only used as a poison. San, Khoi, Zulu, Xhosa, and Sotho, peoples have used it for at least 16 categories of traditional medicine, including pain relief, anxiety treatment, wound care, and neurological conditions. And Acochanthera, another major arrow poison plant used by San hunters, is the source of awabane, a cardiac glycoside. Awabane became the foundation for modern heart medications. Digoxin, one of the world's most important cardiac drugs, is a structural relative. There are over 22,000 published research papers on awabane, and in 1991, scientists discovered that the human body naturally produces awabane as a hormone. So these ancient hunters weren't just inventing weapons, they were, without knowing it, doing the foundational work of a field that would eventually save millions of lives. One more thing I want to mention, because it's one of those details that just sticks with you. Today, the Juhwansi San of Namibia's Nyanyai Conservancy are the only indigenous people in Africa who still retain the legal right to hunt with traditional weapons. Their poison arrow technology operates on principles that might be essentially unchanged for tens of thousands of years. Sand hunters who use beetle larvae poison, a different system from the plant-based one in the study, dig up to a full meter deep in Kalahari sand to extract cocoons from beneath Commiphora trees. The same genus that produces frankincense and myrrh. They store the cocoons in ostrich eggshell containers and crush the larvae on aged giraffe knuckle bones. And here's a detail that shows just how refined this knowledge system is. The poison is never applied to the arrow tip itself. It goes behind the point, on the foreshaft, so you don't accidentally poison yourself with a nick while handling the arrow. Sometimes the tips are even mounted in reverse orientation, with the poison enclosed inside a reed collar. The bows are weak on purpose. The physics just delivers the chemistry. The chemistry does the killing. These are not people frozen in time. These are people carrying forward an unimaginably deep tradition of knowledge, tested and refined over millennia, with safety protocols built in. As Lombard put it, and I think this is the right framing, this does not mean that the Kalahari bow hunters of today are frozen in time. It demonstrates that their ancestors already had very advanced ways of hunting, long before previously thought, and possibly before anywhere else in the world. And there's one question that I know is going to come up. Could Neanderthals have done this? As far as we know, no. There's zero archaeological evidence for Neanderthals applying toxins to weapons. They were smart, there's no question. They made birch bark tar adhesives as early as 200,000 years ago. Dental analysis shows they used medicinal plants. One sick individual at El Sidrón Cave in Spain appears to have been self-medicating with poplar bark, which contains a natural form of aspirin. But their hunting relied on close-range thrusting spears, not projectile weapons. The bow and arrow system that makes poison delivery efficient seems to be a Homo sapiens innovation. So this particular package, tiny stone tip plus adhesive plus extracted plant toxin plus projectile delivery plus patience to track weakened prey over days, that combination appears to be uniquely ours. Now, what does this open up for the future? The researchers and several independent commentators have said the same thing. This study is a methodological door opener. If these specific toxic alkaloids can survive 60,000 years in sediment under the right conditions, then every other Howiesen's port site, every other Middle Stone Age toolkit with backed microliths is suddenly worth testing. We could potentially map regional poison traditions across ancient Africa. We could see when and where different plant-based chemical systems were developed. We could build a history of human pharmacological knowledge going back into deep time. And if someone finds the same compounds at an even older site, then 60,000 years was just the beginning of what we can detect, not the beginning of the behavior itself. Curtis Marion from Arizona State said it best: poison is a breakthrough adaptation for humans. And now we know it was there by at least 60,000 years ago, in the hands of people who looked at a plant bulb and saw an invisible weapon. The paper's authors wrote one line that I keep coming back to. They said, although the mid-Pleistocene hunters from Umhlatuzana Rock Shelter lacked formal chemical knowledge, our study demonstrates that they had a knowledge system enabling them to identify, extract, and apply toxic plant exudates effectively.